We're in part 2 of our series titled A Generous Life. In this series, we're taking a more comprehensive, Jesus-centered view on generosity. Although we'll talk about money later in this series, we're not just focusing on that. In part 1, we studied how central hospitality is to the generous life. Not only is hospitality an important part of generosity, it's also a non-negotiable part of following Jesus. Hospitality was Jesus' primary means of evangelism. Today we're going to study being generous with our time, or more specifically, how can we be generous with our time that is dedicated to those who you would consider on the outside? We're going to be in Luke chapters 18 and 19 if you want to flip ahead. Do you have a desire for God to move in a powerful way in your life? Growing up, I prayed prayers or sung worship songs that would say, God, I want to see you move in my life. Which is a cool phrase. I want to see you move. I want to feel your presence. I want to know that you're there with me, helping me, guiding me. It's normal for us to go through long periods of time without feeling like God is moving in our lives at all. And so sometimes we cry out to God, I want to know you're there. I want to see you move in my life. Well, my hope for the next 25 minutes is that the Holy Spirit, through my words, is able to help you see how God is already moving around you in powerful ways. Well, throughout history, most gods or kings or extremely powerful people have spaces that they live in that are impressive. They live and work in palaces, mansions, temples, and castles. Usually their spaces are up high, a place you would look up at. These are usually very exclusive places. You have to be somebody to have permission to enter into these palaces, mansions, castles, or temples. They're designed to keep certain types of people out. In Jesus' day, the temple in Jerusalem was the place where God's presence was to reside on earth. Jerusalem was up high on the hill, and the temple was tall and high, all designed to signal the power of God and the smallness of those who aren't God. There were a lot of rules about who could enter the temple grounds and who couldn't. The inner sanctum of the temple, where God's presence was even more exclusive. Only certain priests at certain times could enter. This is all normal. This is how the world worked, and it's how the world still works. However, Jesus is radically different. He's countercultural in every way. Jesus didn't have a palace or castle or mansion or temple. Jesus didn't even have a home. He didn't even have a lean-to shack. When Jesus began his almost 3 years of ministry, he intentionally decided to be homeless. He didn't have a structure that would cause people to respect his wealth or fear his power. He didn't have a place to welcome his friends into and throw big banquets. He didn't have a way to keep the riffraff out. In fact, he did the opposite. He spent the 3 years of his ministry living with the riffraff. He would stay at their homes, eat their food, and depend on their generosity. Of all the things Jesus does with his time, near or maybe even at the top of the list is to spend time with people who are outsiders or marginalized or hurting or hated by the majority culture. It seems to me, based on the information we have on his life in the 4 gospel accounts, he spent a great amount of his time doing this. Now, it starts with his disciples he chose to follow him. They're a strange group of guys. Most aren't educated. Most are poor. One is a tax collector, which is awful. Outside of that group, he had women who follow him just as close as the disciples. There are women who had had demons. Women who were sick. There are a few rich women who would fund a good portion of his ministry, which is also not normal. And that's just the start. Jesus is continually leaving his disciples to visit people in need or spend time with people who are outsiders. He gets interrupted. He changes the plan. He delays trips and generally frustrates those closest to him because he's constantly leaving to visit someone else. In the book of Luke alone, we see some of the following moments. Jesus allowed his dinner event to be interrupted by a paralyzed man being dropped through the roof of the house Jesus was visiting. He took time to meet with Levi, the tax collector. He sought out the man with the shriveled hand. He left to go visit the centurion, who is a Roman soldier. He leaves to go raise the widow's son from the dead. He allows a sinful woman to anoint him in a scandalous way, interrupting another dinner event. He visited people in Samaria, which is a dangerous place for a Jew to go. Those are just a handful of the examples in the book of Luke alone. But there are two specific examples of this behavior near the end of the book of Luke I'd like us to take a deeper look at. A couple different moments where Jesus goes out of his way to spend time with people who were considered outsiders. Let's start in Luke chapter 18, verse 35. As Jesus approached Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard the crowd going by, he asked what was happening. They told him, "Jesus of Nazareth is passing by." He called out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Those who led the way rebuked him and told him to be quiet. But he shouted all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stopped and ordered the man to be brought to him. When he came near, Jesus asked him, "What do you want me to do for you?" "Lord, I want to see," he replied. Jesus said to him, "Receive your sight. Your faith has healed you." Immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus, praising God. When all the people saw it, they also praised God. In this story, we're close to the end of Jesus' life. He's been on a journey to Jerusalem. We're a few days away, maybe a day away from Palm Sunday. We're most likely a week away from Jesus being executed on a cross. Jesus knows he's going to be killed. He's warned his disciples several times, but they don't understand. Jesus also knows that he has a lot to do this final week of his life. There's a lot jam-packed in. His schedule, as we read later on in the story, is busy. What's frustrating to the disciples on this journey to Jerusalem, and come to think about it, it's been frustrating to them throughout the whole story of Jesus' ministry, is that Jesus is always stopping along the way. Jesus isn't in a hurry. In this story, a blind man hears a crowd of people coming down the road. It must have been loud. He asks what is going on, and someone lets him know that Jesus of Nazareth is coming through. This man had obviously heard about Jesus. Most likely he had heard stories of how Jesus could heal people. Instead of being skeptical or scoffing at these obviously embellished or fairy tale stories, this blind man believed in Jesus' power. But what kind of power did this man believe in? Who did he think Jesus was? Did he just believe in Jesus' power to heal, or did he believe Jesus was something more? So he yells out to Jesus, and the followers of Jesus who were leading the procession told him to shut up. The last thing they wanted was this dirty beggar interrupting Jesus on his way to become king of Israel. But the blind man yells again, saying, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Somehow this man knew that Jesus was the descendant of David, and everyone at the time knew that the Messiah would be a descendant of David. People didn't just throw around the word son of David without meaning something more. More often than not, those words meant that this person is the Messiah. Somehow this blind beggar seemed to have connected the dots. Jesus hears this man yelling out, stops the whole traveling caravan, and interacts with the man. He tells him that his faith has healed him. Then we get to the very next story in Luke chapter 19, verse 1. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was the chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He has gone to be with a guest of a sinner." Can you believe that? But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today, salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost." This time, instead of an outsider seeking Jesus out, Jesus seeks the outsider. Many of you heard this story before about Zacchaeus, the wee little man. For those of you newer to the story, Zacchaeus had sold out to the oppressors of Israel, the Roman Empire. Zacchaeus partnered with Rome to collect taxes from his fellow Jews, thus betraying his own people. They really did hate this man. Jesus sees him up in a tree and invites himself over to Zacchaeus' house. Now, Jesus is supposed to be headed up to Jerusalem. He has places to be, but once again, he gets distracted and decides to spend the evening in the home of one of the most hated men in Israel. Once again, Jesus is spending time with the wrong crowd. How much time do you spend with the wrong crowd? How much time do I spend with the wrong crowd? Okay, well, that's plenty of scripture to make the point that is probably pretty clear by now. If we are trying to live as followers of Jesus, which I believe most of us are, then that means we should try to embody the values of Christ in the way we live our lives. It seems clear to me, based on what I read in the Gospels over and over, that Jesus put a high value on seeking out the outsiders, spending time with them, and connecting with them. This is at the top of Jesus' values list, so it should be at the top of ours too. But if I'm honest, this isn't near the top of my values list. It's actually pretty far down. And I don't think I'm alone in this. My struggle with this, I think, is pretty normal in the church. But why is that? Well, a common answer I hear is that we're too busy. Busyness is our issue, especially living in the West Coast of America. It's crazy. There's so many things fighting for our time. Many of us work for companies that require long hours. We have kids' activities or church activities, and it goes on and on. It's easy to get exhausted with how busy we all can be. There's not enough time in the day. I get it. And I often feel it. But I want to push back on that a little bit. As busy as life can feel, I also somehow have time to binge watch the latest TV show. Some of you crazy busy people can take out your iPhone and look at the screen time metrics, the stats on your phone, and see that you spend like 3 hours a day scrolling social media. As busy as we are, somehow we still have time for certain things. Which makes me think that busyness isn't always the core issue. It certainly can be at times, and it's good to build in more margin in our schedules so that we're not overcommitted. But I really do think that we have time for the things we value. If we value it, we create time for it. If you value your kids playing 2 sports each at the same time, you make time to drive them all over the place. If you value doom scrolling through social media, you make time for it. My theory is that we don't spend our time more in alignment with Jesus because we don't really value what Jesus values, myself included. One of the things we can tend to value more than we should is hard work. Our culture, and even more specifically, the culture in America, puts a really large emphasis on hard work as a primary life value. Survey-based research shows America at the top of the list globally when it comes to how much we value hard work compared to other countries around the world. It's important to us. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it can be. In the gospel life, the life of following Jesus, hard work isn't at the top of the list of values. It's a good thing if it's submissive to the other more important values. Let me give you an example. All indications are that Mother Teresa worked really hard, especially at the peak of her organization's impact. She was a busy woman. However, her busyness was always submissive to the value of loving and helping those who were struggling. She would be known to cancel a fundraising meeting or cancel an interview with a newspaper reporter if someone hurting reached out to her and needed her more. In her busyness, it appears her values stayed aligned with Christ much of the time. You see, hard work isn't our goal as followers of Christ. It may at times be a byproduct of following Christ, but it certainly is never a goal. Jesus wasn't in a hurry to get things done. His disciples kept trying to hurry him along because they had places to be. And then Jesus would change the plan last minute because he'd want to help someone that they would have never dared help. So hard work can be one of the values that we have out of alignment with Jesus. Another one is the way we value people could be out of alignment with the way Jesus values people. Most of us have prejudices against people who are different or who are outsiders to our preferred way of life. It's human nature and often implicit or subconscious. There are so many people that are difficult to be around for all sorts of different reasons. Have you ever seen a certain person and you really didn't want to interact with them because you wouldn't know what to say, you don't really think you have anything in common with them, and your assumption is that it would just be really awkward, so you avoid them? Have you ever avoided a certain neighborhood because of impressions you have about certain types of people in that neighborhood? Have you ever avoided someone because you could tell they have a different political views than you and you know you'd just get really angry with them? Have you ever avoided people or encouraged your kids to avoid certain people because you feel like all the things you don't like about their way of life would rub off on you or rub off on your kids in a negative way? These are all normal and common feelings for us all to have. I have these feelings all the time. I'm constantly tempted to avoid certain types of people that I know Jesus would for sure pursue. To be really transparent, I've avoided going to a sporting event because it was Pride Day at the ballpark. I spent years wearing big headphones and not making eye contact with people on BART trains when I was commuting to the city because I didn't want to be bothered by anyone. At the same time, I was running an evangelism advertising program on those same BART trains, which I've talked about in the past. It's crazy. I've been disappointed with the ethnicity of a new neighbor because I selfishly preferred someone of a different culture who I could more easily connect with. Now, these are hard truths for me to confess, and to be honest, I'm embarrassed by them as I say them out loud. None of us like to admit we struggle with different types of people. However, we can take some comfort in the fact that everyone struggles in this way. And Jesus' disciples really, really struggled with this. It's part of our sin nature. And what helps is not to try to make an argument that you don't have any prejudices or fears of different people, like somehow you're not human. But to take a more spiritually humble approach and to open up our hands and our heart and ask Jesus to reveal to us ways we might be prejudiced against outsiders that maybe you haven't even been fully aware of or fully willing to acknowledge. One thing that has helped me improve in this area of my life is changing my definition and expectation of what it means for God to be active in my life. I really do want God to move in a powerful way in my life and in the lives of people around me. However, for most of my life, my expectation of God moving had more to do with me getting things to go my way. If I feel sad, I want God to help me feel joy. If I don't like my job, I want God to move and help me get a better job. For couples who are struggling to get pregnant, they'll want God to move so that they can get pregnant. Now, none of these are bad. In fact, they're all good things. Feeling more joy is great. But I think oftentimes our expectation of God moving in our lives revolve way too much around us hoping to get what we want. And I don't see Jesus expecting God to move in these same ways. Jesus had a lot of problems, he had a lot of challenges, but he never expected God to remove those problems or even prayed for God to. Well, except maybe in the Garden of Gethsemane, but that's very different than what we face. Rather, Jesus saw these challenges as opportunities to love people well. I believe, based on what I see in the life of Jesus, that whenever we encounter someone in need, someone different from us, someone on the outside of what you consider normal, then God is moving in your life. Let me say that again. Whenever we encounter someone in need, someone different from us, someone on the outside of what you consider normal, then God is moving in your life. I remember I was leaving my office at our building in Livermore on my way to a lunch meeting with a church member. And as I was walking to my truck, a guy stopped me and asked if I could talk. He was a rough-looking white dude. He was all tatted up. You can tell he had a rough go of it. My first instinct was to figure out how quickly I could acknowledge this guy and then get out of the conversation. But as I started talking to him, I had a moment where I suddenly felt a wave of compassion as he began sharing his situation. I ended up blowing off my lunch meeting. I took this guy in my truck through the McDonald's drive-thru to get lunch. And then I took him to BART and I bought him a ticket so he could go visit his son and his son's mom in Fremont. I don't know how much of his really sad story was true or a lie, but it really didn't matter to me at that time. I had this strong urge to help him that unfortunately was out of the ordinary for me. I mean, I usually miss those moments. But what was also really cool is that I felt like I needed that moment more than this guy did. We were still deep into the pandemic at the time. I mean, not in the heart of the shutdown, but sometime after that. And things weren't normal. Church was a mess. People were mad about politics and masking and on. And I was feeling low. The opportunity to help this guy lifted my spirits so much. And I felt God moving in a way I desperately needed to feel. And I know the reality was that God was always moving through COVID, but for some reason I wasn't seeing it as much. What's so cool about how God works is that when we act this way like Jesus, we often end up getting blessed the most. We find comfort, healing, joy. We need these interactions just as much, sometimes more so, than the people we consider on the outside do. How often have some of us been praying for God to move in our lives for a long time? All the while, God was moving in incredible ways all around us, but because we had a misunderstanding of what that meant, we missed it. We cried out to God that we just want to hear from him. Lord, I just want to hear you. And then he'd send different people our way, and we completely missed it because we lost track of how Jesus really behaves. Now, bringing people different than us across our path isn't the only way God moves in our lives, but it is a primary way. And a good habit for us to get into is when we encounter someone different and we feel those feelings of either fear or awkwardness or of being uncomfortable, we need to recognize it as God moving, as an opportunity to be caught up in the work and movement of a God that never stops loving. It's those feelings that oftentimes tempt us to avoid people that are actually the flashing lights that should trigger an alert that God is moving. This change in perspective opens up the door for us to see God moving everywhere. This is how we find the true and deep joy of Christ, the movement of Christ, and the purpose that we were all designed for. Now, getting good at this, it takes a belief that God really is moving through other people crossing your path. But then it takes the courage to step into the moment and interact with someone you would normally avoid, and then see what God does with that. A quick caveat or clarification that I do want to make in this regard is I'm not telling you to enter into situations that are dangerous and put your well-being at risk. Sometimes when you feel fear, you need to heed its warning because there can be real danger. We do need to be able to have discernment of when to engage when it's scary. Like, is it just scary and I need to have courage and step up and be like Jesus? Or is it the type of scary where this is signaling real danger and I actually need to back away and not put myself and others in harm's way? So I just want to be clear about what I'm saying in regards to that. And also, I don't want to challenge us in this way to make you feel bad about yourself or to shame you for not being enough like Jesus. We're all so far away, but we're all on this journey of being formed into the likeness of Jesus. all the times we fall way short, which is almost all the time, we know that God's grace covers us. It's okay. But we also don't need to lower the bar that Jesus set for us. Jesus set a really high bar that requires us to live in and depend on the power of the Holy Spirit. We shouldn't settle for a lesser version of what Jesus calls us to be just because we feel so far away from it. And the last thing is, this isn't necessarily adding something to your task list. This isn't more stuff for you to do for Jesus that's just going to overwhelm you and make you more busy and be like, oh my gosh, I'm not doing enough. Rather, I view this as this challenge as something you can incorporate into your existing list of things you already do. Like, as you parent, you can keep your eye out for people who are outsiders. As you work, you can keep your eye out for people who are left out. As you go to school, et cetera, et cetera. You know, in football, like if you've ever played football, they teach you to have your head on a swivel, right? Where you're watching everything that's going on around you because you don't want to be surprised by someone coming from the side who's just going to crush you. And it's kind of the same way as we go about our day. I'd encourage you to have your head on a swivel, looking for God moving through other people coming across your path. Let's pray that in this coming week, God would give each of us a person to interact with that we would normally avoid, and that we would all be on the lookout for that person. It's actually not a huge ask of us, and I believe that it can bring transformational in our lives and in our church community. Let me pray. Jesus, we love you so much, Lord, and we recognize how much you move in the scriptures and what your movement is like and what your movement consisted of. And so much of the time, what it meant for you to move in the stories of your life was for you to either receive the outsider or to go find the outsider, the person who was different, the person who was not included, the person who was hurting. And so, Jesus, we want to be like you. And we ask for your forgiveness and your grace to continue to cover us when we fall short, but we also want you to give us the eyes and the heart to be able to really see the people around us who need to be seen, and to have the courage to take a moment out of our day to say hi, to say, how are you doing, and to find out a little bit about their story. Not expecting that we can do anything powerful, but expecting that you can do something powerful through that. And oftentimes, Lord, I expect that we're going to find a ton of blessings in that, Lord. And so as a church community, God, I ask that you would help us in this regard. Help us to be generous with our time towards those who are different. And let us transform us and let it make us more like you, Jesus. We ask for this all in your powerful name. Amen.
Wait, before you go, 3 things. First, please consider becoming one of Cornerstone Fellowship's financial partners. Your donations will ensure that you'll be able to continue enjoying helpful and hopefully life-changing messages like the one you just watched. And number 2, please share the link to this message with anyone who you know needs it or will be blessed by it, or post the link to your own personal social platforms. And finally, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you'll be alerted whenever we post more content. Thanks for watching.